Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here again and to be able to do another presentation. It's a co-authored paper. It's co-authored with Ariana Garcia. It's a PhD student of mine, and Maarten Voors, a colleague from Wageningen University. I'm actually based in two universities, University of Groningen and Wageningen University, both in the Netherlands. It's a microfinance paper, but it's a different microfinance paper than I normally present. People have seen me presenting maybe several times. Most of my presentation on microfinance are presenting RCTs, randomized controlled trials, experimental work, and focusing on the impact of microcredit as such, or microfinance trainings, etc. So this is another type of a paper. It's not an experimental paper. It's using observational data, but it's dealing with a kind of a new topic. And I think we are one of the first authors trying to link microfinance with a new research area, and this research area of psychological constraints, aspirations, hope, and motivations. So the paper is called, the title is Does Microcredit Increase Aspirational Hope? Evidence from a group lending scheme in Sierra Leone. So a little bit about the context. So if you look at the development economics literature, then normally poverty is associated with external constraints. So a lack of credit, or a lack of education, lack of access to education, etc. Also, if you look at the microfinance studies, or the microfinance impact studies, most microcredit studies especially focus on the impact of relieving external credit constraints. So the idea is that if you are faced with an external constraint, for instance, the lack of credit, your credit constraints, so you're not able to grow. Now, if you're looking a little bit more about the recent microfinance paper, there's a huge amount of microfinance papers around. And I think many of us here, many people around here, do know those papers. And Maren, I don't know where Maren is sitting, but she did many surveys, even surveys of surveys. So, and what we see from the microfinance literature is a kind of a mixed picture. Some papers are positive, some are negative, and what you also see is that the more experimental, the more rigorous papers are becoming, the less positive effects those papers show. So what the most recent, let's say the most recent group of more experimental RCTs on microcredit, they actually conclude that the effects of microcredit are small. They are there, but they're small and very often not transformative. So the question which comes up a little bit here is actually relieving external constraints enough? So what you do, you give people credit, you relieve an external constraint, but is that enough to get kind of growth going on? Now, what we try to argue in this paper, and we link that to a recent literature, is that actually that there is also an importance of internal constraints. Hope, aspirations, motivations, so kind of psychological constraints. So maybe it is the case that interventions that reduce external constraints become only effective if also internal constraints are addressed. Yeah? So maybe you need to do both. So changing external constraints like access to credit, maybe they only affect outcomes if internal constraints are not binding. So you may give people a lot of credit, but if they're not motivated to do anything with it, or don't have any aspirations, then nothing will happen probably. Yeah, so there's where this paper is starting from. So aspirations may be too low. And what we do in this paper, the contribution of this paper is, we look at the microcredit program in Sierra Leone from BRAC. BRAC is one of the biggest microfinance organizations in the world, originally from Bangladesh. And what we find here is actually a bit more positive picture. We find that microcredit increases both material well-being, so economic effects, but also that it releases internal psychological constraints. And we argue that we give here some evidence for a new channel by which microfinance, microcredit, may improve welfare or even contribute to the SDGs. So this is a little bit the idea of this paper. Now, a little bit about the theory. I will not delve in it too much, but a little bit. There is a recent literature, small literature, which argues, which discusses the role of hope and aspirations in helping understand how people can move out of poverty. There's several authors, from psychological authors, but also economists, also people like Esther Duflo, have written quite a few papers in the last decade about the importance of enhancing hope and aspiration of people. Now, if you look in this literature, then there are different ways how you can measure and define hope. Yeah? And the type of hope most of those people are looking at is in ways that hope is defined as a perception that something desired may happen. Yeah? So that is the way how they look at hope. And what a couple of those papers do, and especially the theoretical papers, there are a few theoretical papers in this group of new literature, they look at what they call aspirational hope. It is a paper, for instance, by Bruce Wittig and others, published a year ago in Economic Development Cultural Change, where they developed a new theoretical model focusing on what they call aspirational hope, and to what extent changing aspirational hope is important to, let's say, to induce a process of increasing welfare. Now, aspirational hope contains actually three parts. It contains aspirations, pathways, so you should know how you can go from one point to another, and you should have some agency. Now, here is a quote, an already old quote, that says that an individual must have a goal, kind of aspiration, see a pathway to reaching that goal, and believe that she's able to achieve the goal by progressing along the pathway. So it's all about aspirational hope containing aspiration, pathways, and agency. Now a little bit more about those three concepts. So aspirations, what is aspirations? Now aspirations is something like what you desire to get in the future. Yeah? So something, a strong desire to achieve something high or great in the future. Aspirations as such are not exogenous. Aspirations are determined by your environment, so are socially determined. And it's important because I use this theory to explain later why being involved in a microfinance group lending program may help you to improve your aspirations. So aspirations may be socially determined, and the aspirations are also partly set by the peers around you. So depending on what the peers do, so if you have a neighbor who's whatever, having a nice car, you might get inspired also to want to have a nice car or whatever. So it's the peers around you, and especially role models around you, may influence or may enhance your own aspirations, yeah? According to this theory. If you talk about aspirations, then in this, let's say, theoretical modeling, there's three concepts that are important here. First is the aspiration window. So that's the aspiration you set yourself. So what aspiration do you have? Now the aspiration window is in a way set by the people around you, by peers, very often by similar type of people around you. Yeah, so aspiration is set by your peers. Then there's an aspiration gap. That's the difference between where you're now, where you want to be in the future. Now, if there's a big aspiration gap, this may induce you to put more effort in some activities. So if in one way an intervention can increase your aspiration gap, that may induce you to put more effort in some activities, which may help you to grow out of poverty. That's a little bit the idea here. But there may also be an aspiration failure. If your aspiration gap is too high, or too small, but also too high, then you may get frustrated. Yeah? So if you have a very high aspiration gap, but you find out after a month that you don't have credit to do anything, then you got an aspiration failure, so you will fail. So probably it's kind of both things which are important. So you need to try to enhance your aspiration gap, but you should also have pathways or means to reach that aspiration in the future. Yeah? Okay. What is the implications of the theories on aspirational hope? Now, intervention, the main explanation or implication already explained is that intervention with focus on relaxing external constraints will not change any effort and hence outcomes if internal constraints are binding. Yeah? So whatever you do, it will not help. Now, an intervention that increases aspirations generates an inspiration gap, and if the inspiration gap is not too big, then people will be encouraged to take actions to narrow the gap, which may boost your activities. Yeah, that's the idea. Now, there's different interventions going on, have been done already. There are a couple of papers being published or coming out, where people try to do experiments trying to enhance aspiration of people. What the most common intervention is that exposing individuals to role models. So there's a couple of interventions going on where people are showing videos of people from the village who became successful. Yeah, so there's some studies done in Ethiopia who did this. And there is also some studies where they try to interact with peers, stimulating interactions with peers. I'm myself involved with 2 RCTs on this, and other papers on this one in Bolivia, where we try to stimulate or enhance aspirations of farmers to improve milk production. We have even we do this together with a milk company, so we can measure at a daily basis how much milk farmers are selling to the company. And we do this by giving an aspiration training, and we made a video of the most successful farmers in the neighborhood. We showed the video to a group of farmers, and we're trying to measure whether this increases milk production. And we're starting up now, actually this week, in Ghana, a study where we try to aspire people to save more for their pensions by working together with a pension organization. We're showing videos of old people who are still very successful, and they are on this video telling stories about why they're still at now, let's say, being able to have a nice life, and that this is partly due to that when they were young, that they were thinking about the pensions and were saving, etc., etc. Similar studies have been done before. In this study, we're not doing that. We're not doing at any experimental intervention. We're just looking at the microfinance, let's say, intervention which is going on. And the idea here is that microcredit, especially in groups, microcredit provided via a group lending scheme improves social interaction and reduces exposure to role models during the weekly meetings, which potentially enhances aspirations. That's what we try to test, and try to test it in different ways. Yeah? Now, the hypothesis we have 3 hypotheses. Participation in a microcredit group lending scheme enhances aspirations. That's what we try to test. Participation in a microcredit group lending scheme enhances agency and pathways. That's what we try to test. And participation in a microcredit group lending scheme enhances economic outcomes partly through aspirations. So we also look at the traditional variables. So we look at the impact of participation in a microfinance scheme on economic welfare variables, income and production. But we argue that this only will take place if also aspirations went up. Yep. Okay. So let's speed up a little bit. The context here is the program. We're looking at this in Sierra Leone. Now, some figures about Sierra Leone. More than 50% of the population are living on less than 1.90 US$ per day, so many poor people, of course. 13% economically active population with access to financial services, so most people don't have access to financial services. The source of credit people have is relative, friends, neighbors, Roscas, and a little bit of microfinance. The program we're looking at is a standard BRAC group lending system, where BRAC gives women to expand business. Average loan size is 145 US dollars. In total, the program serves more than 21,000 women, 29 brand offices, and there's a group lending system with joint liability. So people borrow in groups, and this is a joint liability system. Now, which is important for the, let's say, the identification strategy we use in this paper is the eligibility criteria of the borrowers. So the BRAC uses eligibility criteria, so not everybody is allowed to borrow. So only women between 18 and 15 years were allowed to borrow. Only they should have a business, only one member per household, no outstanding loans with other MFIs, and living in an area at least 3 years, and this is very important for our identification strategy, which I will explain in a minute, they should live within a 4-kilometer radius from the branch office. Yeah? So only people within a radius of 4 kilometers around the branch office are allowed to borrow. A group lending methodology system, now I will skip that. So a little bit about the sampling strategy, very quickly. So what is important here, that people are, there is a branch, and only people within the 4-kilometer radius of the branch are allowed to borrow. So what we did, we also know the other eligibility criteria. We sampled people within the 4-kilometer radius from the branch. We sampled that people who did borrow, who are a member of the microfinance institution, and who didn't borrow. Yeah? But both groups were eligible. We also sampled people outside the 4-kilometer radius, where nobody could become a member of the organization, but we used eligibility criteria, so we sampled people outside the area who are in principle eligible to borrow and could borrow if the branch would have been closer to where they were living. So we had basically 3 groups. People with access and participants, so within the radius, with access and non-participants within the radius but not borrowing, and non-access and non-participants. Now, what we basically did for our identification strategy, and I will make it very short because otherwise I will run out of time, is we used a double difference methodology. So what we basically did, by first looking at the access area, we estimated those people who were participating. Yeah? So we have within the area we have 2 groups, access participating, access non-participating. We estimated with a logic model the probability of participating. Using this result, we forecasted for outside of the area those who have a high probability of participating if they were possible to participate, and a low possibility. And then we made up 4 groups, 2 within, 2 without. So we're having a group within who was borrowing, outside who should normally borrow if possible, and within who could borrow but didn't do, outside who couldn't borrow but will also not borrow if they could. Using those 4 groups, we could run a normal difference and difference, use a normal difference and difference methodology, which is normally done in time. We do it in space. All details are in the paper, so I will skip all those methodological issues. Very quickly about the measures we use. We measure agency and pathways, which is one of the hypotheses we test. What we did here, we used the so-called Snyder scale. Snyder was a psychologist, and he developed a scale for agencies and pathways. So 6 questions, and we use principal component analysis to make one index for agency and pathways. We have aspirational hope variables. First 2 variables which we call economic aspirational hope. So we asked people about what would your income be in the coming year if it were a good year, or what would your income be in the coming year if it's a bad year. And that's 2 of our aspirational hope indices. A more important one is how we measure aspirations as such. For measuring aspirations, we sampled, we showed this image of a cotton tree, which is a national symbol in Sierra Leone, and we made 10 levels, and we asked them, what level are you now, and what level do you want to be in the future? Yeah? The higher, the better it is. So that's the way how we measure aspirations now, aspiration in the future, and aspiration gap, the difference between the two. Yeah? Then we had two measures for economic welfare, income, and an index for durable assets. And then we did the estimates. Now we had 4 estimation techniques, but the main one is this double difference. And I'm not going to explain you the details of the estimation, but what we found in the end is we find statistically significant impacts of microcredit participation on life aspirations. Yeah? Quite big impact. We didn't find we did find a positive effect, a non-significant effect on agency and pathways. Maybe because of the index we use is not focusing very much on credit as such. It's a more general index, so maybe you're mismeasuring. We found a positive and significant effect of aspirational hope, the economic aspirational effects, hope variables, and we found a positive effect, small positive effect on economic welfare variables. Now this is the first part of the paper. There are 2 more things, if I'm allowed, very quickly. The first one is we had a hypothesis about that economic welfare effects were in a way mediated via aspirations. So the hypothesis there was that microcredit will only affect economic welfare, or will affect economic welfare partly via aspirations. Now, the way how to test this is, let's say, rigorously testing this is impossible, because everything is endogenous. But what you could do here is what we did. Economists don't like this. I'm an economist, so I'm also a little bit. We had a fight in our team, should we do it or not? But we did it. We did a mediation analysis, a standard mediation analysis. People in management use it very often. In psychology, they all do this mediation type of analysis. And mediation analysis gives us some confidence, support to the idea that the effects of economic welfare for microcredit go partly via aspirations. Yeah? But the analysis is certainly non-rigorous. And then the last part of the paper is about how can we explain the effects of microcredit or microfinance participation on aspiration. Now here we're going back to our theory, and we argue here that it goes via the group meetings and via the better of people within the groups. So we did some additional analysis by using a subsample of our sample, by using more detailed information, group information about 350 participants participating in lending groups. And we measured different ways, and the main, results of this analysis were as follows: that the more frequent a member attends the meetings, the group meetings, the higher her life aspirations. So it gives us some support for our idea that the aspirations may be enhanced by group meetings. Yeah? The further away a member lives from the meeting place, the lower her life aspirations. The more weekly meetings a member misses, the lower her life aspirations. And we found a positive relationship between the aspiration of the most well-off person in the group and the life aspiration of the other group members. So also some evidence for that life aspiration, that people look at peers, and especially the most successful peers in the group. Yeah? So this is about it. So to conclude, we find some evidence for positive effects of microcredit on welfare, normal economic welfare, but more importantly here on life aspiration and aspirational hope. We're the first paper who explored this view, I think. We find via the mediation analysis some confidence that life aspirations mediate the effects on household durable assets and other economic welfare variables, so suggesting that credit relieving external constraints only affect welfare if at the same time the internal constraints are relieved, or if internal constraints are not binding. And we find some evidence for the fact that, that there's a positive relation between microcredit and life aspirations, possibly runs through two channels. So microcredit improves social interaction and connectedness within groups, and role models in lending groups increase aspirations of other group members. And really, finally, the study suggests that microcredit may play an important role in relieving psychological constraints. However, here a reminder, look, I'm still a RCT guy, so I'm still kind of saying that the identification strategies, we tried our best. We even did placebo testing, etc. So there is a kind of appendix, which is as long as the paper itself, and placebo testing and rigorous testing. But there's obviously a lot of endogeneity going on, so a lot of our results are maybe more descriptive than causal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a few comments. I'm going to really plead you make them very short. There are 4 speakers in this session, and I think we have a hard deadline at 6. So short questions or comments. I have 1, I have 2. All right, 2 comments.
So you see, my old Groningen colleagues are going to kill me. I see here one, I see that.
Robert was my PhD
No, I'm not.
so I enjoyed it very much. No. So yes, so aspiration is a very good thing, and we need it. But according to your empirical or experimental, your variables, we didn't see why microfinance, microcredit, why it has to be microcredit.
Doesn't have to be.
What are the differences if we just go to, like, church?
Yeah. No.
So it's all about social connections. It's all about role models. If that is the case, what is the role that is playing by the money?
No, I think that the main role of microcredit, no, you're right. The important part is about the social connections within the groups. The missing part, if you only have a group, then you may fall into what we call this aspiration failure. So the group may enhance your aspirations, but then if you want to start up a firm or whatever, a business, your aspirations are enhanced, but you don't have any money to start with. You may become frustrated. So the credit is in a way important to also relieve your external constraints. So the point we make here is a combination of the two. And microfinance group lending is doing 2 things at the same time. Yeah? So it's a combination of the 2, which makes it successful. Yeah?
But do you have that money in the model?
Yes, because the people are borrowing, but we cannot separate the effects. Look, this is a kind of observational data. We have no way of separating the effects. So we are only arguing, and we finding kind of support for this hypothesis. But we cannot rigorously test the different effects.
Okay, let me ask, and then you can do it. I'm not sure if it's relevant given your empirical methodology, but are you able to control for the household composition and things like, disability, for example? Because I'm thinking about Sierra Leone, disability in among women in your sample, or disability, for example, of their dependents. And then how, because I would think that it could...
It's individual level data, so we controlled for household size and this type, that type of thing. So only women, of course, here in the sample.
Right.
I don't know what type of controls we had. It was before the data was collected before the Ebola crisis, so this disability.
Right, but if you have a child, an amputee child, I suppose, that could... I could,
yeah,
no, it could affect your aspirations positively or
negatively. Sure, I see your point. So in principle, yes, but depending on the data we precisely have. So we don't have all this information.
But selection, right? Selection into those, to recipients of microcredit and So basically, you try to control for the selection, right?
Oh, yeah.
As-
So
as-
the selection effect is controlled for in a similar way as a normal fixed effects model. In
Oh,
a
I
way,
see.
because it's a kind of a double difference. So
Right, okay.
what we do, we look at
That's right.
the impact of microcredit, controlling for the selection effect from the non-participants to the participants, and the regional effect. So there's a double difference in that way. But of course, there's still unmeasurables, which may change or may have differential effect in the two regions, which we cannot control for.
All right, very quick last question, very, very quick.
Just a quick comment. It's great to see you again pioneering, getting into this, because this is really interesting, and it's new, and it's good to see that. But my question is, are all the microcredit programs the same in terms of aspiration content? And if not, I mean, are you able to start looking at that and see whether, you do a meta study of microcredit programs around the world and come up with some other, again, sort of, because these are very persuasive anyway, but
Yeah.
I think
No,
maybe
no,
that's
no,
another
you're
route.
right. You're right. Look, it's somewhat difficult to do. The argument we make here in the paper is that it is mainly due to the group lending systems. Now, many microfinance programs at the moment are using individual lending and are not using the group lending system anymore. So that may be one possibility. But the problem, of course, is that those organizations who mainly use individual lending and not using the group lending system anymore are focusing on other type of clients. So you have a kind of a selection problem going on to comparing it. But yeah, it would be nice to try. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause.